Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic actually comes to us from numerous commenters. I've actually gotten multiple requests to do a video about Thranduil, Legolas's dad. Yeah, you want to come through? We have a little interruption by Kittalor. Hello, Kittalor. Kittalor is very interested in Thranduil as well. All right. Yeah. You want to jump down? Okay. Good girl. Samesh and Andreas specifically asked for a video about the history of Thranduil. Vincenzo asked whether Thranduil faced the Serpents of the North, as was mentioned in one of the Hobbit movies. And Marty Giavoto asked about a little bit of the history of Dol Guldur, since that's in Mirkwood, which is also where we find Thranduil. I thought maybe I could wrap that up as well. So we're going to handle a bunch of commenters in one. Here we go. Okay, so there are some gaps in our knowledge about Thranduil, but there's a whole lot that we know. Obviously, he's Legolas's dad. Also, he plays fairly prominently in The Hobbit. So we have some good sources to pull from and some good info. I'm going to start by reading you a quote from The Return of the King. This is from the appendices, a lot of good knowledge there. This quote is regarding the Second Age. In the beginning of this age, many of the High Elves still remained. Most of these dwelt in Lindon, west of the arid Lewin. But many of the Sindar passed eastward, and some established realms in the forests far away, where their people were mostly Sylvan Elves. Thranduil, king in the north of Greenwood the Great, was one of these. So we can actually get a lot of information about Thranduil from this quote. It says, in the beginning of this age, many of the High Elves still remained. Many of the Sindar passed eastward. Thranduil was one of these. It's kind of the summary of that. All right, so we know that Thranduil was a Sindar elf, that he went eastward instead of going west over the sea, and he took up with Sylvan Elves. But it also mentions that he remained, meaning he'd been around in the First Age, and that's important. Thranduil's dad is named Aurafur, and he's very important. He is the king before Thranduil is. And I think it's fair to say that Aurafur and Thranduil both lived in Doriath back in the First Age. Doriath, known as the Land of the Fence, was a kingdom that was ruled by King Thingol. And this is pretty important because events that happen in Doriath and with King Thingol get reflected later in the lives and personalities of Aurafur and Thranduil. One of the more remarkable things about Thingol is, with the help of the dwarves, Thingol creates Menegroth, which is a cave system. He lives underground. We're going to see this reflected later when Thranduil attempts to mimic Menegroth in Mirkwood. Also, a terrible tragedy befalls Thingol at the hands of the dwarves. Thingol has one of the Silmaril gems, one of the most valuable items in Tolkien mythology, wishes for the dwarves to place it on this necklace known as the Nauglamir, which is a very valuable dwarven artifact. The dwarves do so, but in so doing, they become enamored with this item and are like, hey, as payment for doing this, we want this item. Thingol says, what are you, crazy? That's why I had you do this in the first place. I want the Silmaril gem. What are you talking about? They have a disagreement, and the dwarves kill Thingol. That leads to death and destruction on both sides. Menegroth gets sacked at some point. It's a big deal. But you're going to see this again later reflected in some verbiage in The Hobbit, and we'll talk about that when it happens. But just know that Aurafur and Thranduil probably were there to see this relationship between the dwarves and the elves, also to be living in Menegroth at the time. And so, as I mentioned, that informs the way that they rule. So, Aurafur and Thranduil are these Sindar elves. The elves of the region of Greenwood, later Mirkwood, are known as Sylvan Elves. There's a hierarchy in elfdom, and the Sindar are higher on the totem pole than Sylvan Elves. So when the Sindar come east, they end up taking positions of leadership. It seems like it's a fairly peaceful transition there of leadership, but I would have to imagine that there were some Sylvan Elves that maybe felt aggrieved. But in the most part, we see that the Sylvan Elves are like, yep, you're our leaders, great. So we're in the Second Age, and Aurafur, instead of going west, has gone east to Greenwood, and he is leading this group of Sylvan Elves. And in southern Greenwood, he creates a capital. There's a fortress. It's known as Amon Lanc, otherwise known as Bald Hill. I'm going to guess it's called that because this is a heavily forested area. Perhaps this is like a rocky promontory. And those rocks probably also were good to create a foundation for the fortress. So Amon Lanc is where Aurafur sets up his capital. Now, we know from some of the texts that Aurafur starts moving his people gradually northward into Greenwood. 3 times during the Second Age, he moves north. I'm going to read you here a passage from Unfinished Tales, talks a little bit about their journey. Thranduil's realm is said to have extended into the woods surrounding the Lonely Mountain and growing along the west shores of the Long Lake. The elvish folk of this realm had migrated from the south, being the kin and neighbors of the elves of Lorien, but they had dwelt in Greenwood the Great, east of Anduin. In the Second Age, their king, Aurafur, had withdrawn northward beyond the Gladden fields. This he did to be free from the power and encroachments of the dwarves of Moria, and also he resented the intrusions of Celeborn and Galadriel into Lorien. But as yet, there was little to fear between the Greenwood and the mountains, and there was constant intercourse between his people and their kin across the river, until the War of the Last Alliance. All right, there's some good info in there. We know Aurafur moved 3 times. He started at Amon Lanc in the south, and he ended up over by what they call the Emenduir, the Dark Mountains, in northern Greenwood. That region is eventually where Thranduil builds his halls. So that quote I just read implies maybe some of the reasons why Aurafur was moving. Okay, for one thing, he was concerned about Sauron, but if you noticed, it said, he did this to be free from the power and encroachments of the dwarves of Moria, and also he resented the intrusions of Celeborn and Galadriel into Lorien. I thought that was really interesting. So, okay, first, he's got something against dwarves. Again, maybe this dates back to Doriath and how the dwarves sacked it, essentially, and killed Thingol. He probably has some residual hatred for dwarves. When the dwarves of Moria start influencing the region, he decides, let's move. And apparently, Celeborn and Galadriel did similar things to what Aurafur and Thranduil have done. They are not Sylvan Elves. They basically showed up in Lorien, and it seems like there's maybe a little bit of jealousy there between Aurafur and Celeborn and Galadriel. So if we know that Aurafur moved 3 times gradually northward, and we know some of the reasons why he moved, this is conjecture, but I'll conjecture as to perhaps why and when he moved. As I mentioned, Amon Lanc, this capital, is in southern Greenwood. It's fairly near to Lorien, which is obviously near to Moria. I think perhaps the first time he moves is as a reaction to the dwarves of Moria encroaching. Obviously, Moria existed for a long, long, long time, but if you want to take the time period where it had the most impact on the surrounding regions, it's going to start with the time when they had the relationship with the elves of Eregion. That's Celebrimbor. That's on the other side of the mountains, but still, they had a healthy trading relationship with the elves there. That starts in 750 of the Second Age. And I think gradually they started to have an impact on both sides of the mountains. So, I would say roughly, let's say that around the year 1000 of the Second Age. I'm just saying, if 750 is when this relationship starts, over time it gets, gradually more. At some point, it pushes out to a point that Aurafur feels aggrieved at the presence of dwarves. So I'm going to go with around 1000 of the Second Age Aurafurs like, all right, that's it. We're abandoning Aman-Lanc. Let's go north, farther into Mirkwood. We don't know where he goes from there. But I will throw this out. North of Aman-Lanc is Rhosgobel. Rhosgobel is where Radagast lives in the Third Age. Just throwing this out there. Maybe the reason Radagast chose Rhosgobel was because perhaps there were some ruins of an elven village that he built on. I don't know, perhaps. So it's kind of roughly about the right distance if you were to split the distance between Aman-Lanc and the Dark Mountains into thirds. That first third would pretty much get you to Rhosgobel. So I don't know. Anyway, perhaps there was some ancient village upon which we find Rhosgobel in the Third Age. But in any case, Aurafur moves north, and let's say around the year 1000 of the Second Age. So the next thing it says is that he resented the intrusions of Celeborn and Galadriel into Lorien. Well, we know when Galadriel arrives in Lorien, that is the year 1350. Actually, Celeborn stays behind in Eregion at that time, joins later, but I'm going to think perhaps it's Galadriel showing up in Lorien that is the impetus for yet another move. So if they move for the first time in the year 1000, I think perhaps around 1350, maybe somewhere shortly thereafter, Aurafur might be thinking, I don't like this potential threat to my authority. You know, could Galadriel maybe end up usurping my people? Let's move farther away. And so around 1350, moves a little bit farther north. We don't exactly know what settlement he created at that point, but if you were to think that perhaps the third move north was due to the events happening in the world regarding Sauron, you would think perhaps it's 1695 of the Second Age is when Sauron openly declares war on the elves. He was killing a bunch of folks. It's 1700 that the Númenóreans arrive and Sauron is temporarily defeated. So I'm going to say it's in that 5-year window, 1695 to 1700, where there's a huge threat to the land from Sauron, that Aurafur decides, okay, let's get as far away as possible, and so goes up into the Dark Mountains in northern Greenwood. And I realize this is a lot about Aurafur and not Thranduil, but Thranduil is there. Thranduil is the prince, and he's seeing all this transpire, and he's taking cues from his dad's prejudices against dwarves. Perhaps his mistrust of some of the other elves are things that Thranduil is watching. So now we're going to skip ahead to the end of the Second Age, the War of the Last Alliance. This is very important in the histories of both Aurafur and Thranduil. I'm going to read you a quote about their participation in the War of the Last Alliance. This is from Unfinished Tales. You're going to hear the name Malgal Ad. Malgal Ad was a name that Tolkien originally used for the character known as Amdir. Amdir, at this time, at the end of the Second Age, is actually the leader of the elves of Lorien. Even though Celeborn and Galadriel are associated with Lorien at this time, they are not the leaders. It is Amdir, otherwise known as Malgal Ad. Aurafur had the wisdom to foresee that peace would not return unless Sauron was overcome. He therefore assembled a great army of his now numerous people, and joining with the lesser army of Malgal Ad of Lorien, he led the host of the Sylvan Elves to battle. The Sylvan Elves were hardy and valiant, but ill-equipped with armor or weapons in comparison with the Eldar of the West. Also, they were independent, and not disposed to place themselves under the supreme command of Gil-galad. Their losses were thus more grievous than they need have been, even in that terrible war. Malgal Ad and more than half of his following perished in the great battle of the Daggerlad, being cut off from the main host and driven into the dead marshes. Aurafur was slain in the first assault upon Mordor, rushing forward at the head of his most doughty warriors before Gil-galad had given the signal for the advance. Thranduil, his son, survived, but when the war ended and Sauron was slain, as it seemed, He led back home barely a third of the army that had marched to war. A long peace followed in which the numbers of the Sylvan Elves grew again, but they were unquiet and anxious, feeling the change of the world that the Third Age would bring. But there was in Thranduil's heart a still deeper shadow. He had seen the horror of Mordor and could not forget it. If ever he looked south, its memory dimmed the light of the sun. And though he knew now that it was broken and deserted and under the vigilance of the kings of men, fear spoke in his heart that it was not conquered forever. It would arise again. So, Aurafur is slain. This is where Thranduil becomes king, leads a third of the army back to Greenwood, and it also takes with him this PTSD, right? He watched his father killed on the battlefield, saw so many of his people die. So even though it was his rousing victory for the good guys, for his people, who he now is in charge of, it was a pretty terrible time. Amdir, aka Malgal Ad, is also killed. His army are the ones that are primarily in the dead marshes that we see in the Lord of the Rings. It's this independent streak that Aurafur has that in some ways comes back to bite him in this moment. Yes, they're fighting with Gil-galad and the Alliance, but they're not in the Alliance, per se. If they had accepted Gil-galad as their leader, they probably would have gotten better armor, better weapons, but they did not want to be under that command. And probably given the choice, Gil-galad's like, well, you've got a bunch of elves, I'll take your help. He kind of had to walk a line, right, of like, I want your assistance, I'd really rather you listen to what I had to say, but okay. And Aurafur leads this ill-conceived charge, basically jumps ahead of the rest of the army, and is cut down along with a whole bunch of these Sylvan Elves of the Woodland Realm. A terrible tragedy. And I'm about to show you another way in which this tragedy becomes extra terrible. But that last bit there about Thranduil having this fear in his heart and the horror of Mordor, I think that is what compels him in later years, when Sauron reappears, to go underground, to create these halls. It's an attempt to protect himself and his people. So, the Second Age ends, the War of the Last Alliance, victorious. We now just get to the year 2 of the Third Age. We're in the Third Age, year 2. We have the disaster of Gladden Fields. I've done a couple of videos about this, including a recent one I did about the hobbits and the region of the Gladden Fields. But Thranduil actually has a part to play in the events that transpired. Just to briefly summarize, the disaster of Gladden Fields is where Isildur is killed. The ring is lost. 3 other members of Isildur's family, his adult sons, are all killed off. It's a defining moment in Tolkien's mythology, and it happens in the Third Age, the year 2, very near to Greenwood. Here's a quote from the Unfinished Tales talking about the aftermath of this disaster. There were rescuers who came on the scene too late, but in time to disturb the orcs and prevent their mutilation of the bodies. For there were certain woodmen who got news to Thranduil by runners, and also themselves gathered a force to ambush the orcs, of which they got wind and scattered. For though victorious, their losses had been great, and almost all of the great orcs had fallen. They attempted no such attack again for long years after. So Thranduil arrives onto the scene in the aftermath of this disaster, in time to keep the orcs from mutilating the bodies. You can probably tell right away that this is a royal procession. Knights in armor. There's going to be Isildur's heirs. He wouldn't have found Isildur, but he would have come across his sons. He would have realized the tragedy of this moment pretty quickly. But remember how I mentioned that Aurafur's actions in the War of the Last Alliance became extra tragic. Here's where we see the extra tragedy. This is also from the Unfinished Tales, and this is regarding the orcs that happen to be in this region around the Misty Mountains and the Gladden Fields area, why they were there and waiting to attack Isildur's retinue. But they remained alert and watchful, determined to attack any companies of elves or men that they outnumbered. Thranduil they had let pass, for even his diminished army was far too strong for them. But they bided their time, for the most part hidden in the forest, while others lurked along the riverbanks. It is unlikely that any news of Sauron's fall had reached them, for he had been besieged in Mordor, and all his forces had been destroyed. This small detachment in the north of no account was forgotten. Probably they thought that Sauron had been victorious, and the war-scarred army of Thranduil was retreating to hide in fastnesses of the forest. Thus, they would be emboldened and eager to win their master's praise, though they had not been in the main battles. But it was not his praise they would have won if any had lived long enough to see his revival. No tortures would have satisfied his anger with the bungling fools who had let slip the greatest prize in Middle-earth, even though they could know nothing of the One Ring. Okay, so this is really interesting. This group of orcs had been sent toward the beginning of the War of the Last Alliance to harass any army coming over the mountains, through the mountain passes on their way to Mordor. Gil-galad's army did come through the passes, but they were so big that the orcs were like, all right, we'll just let these guys go. All right, who else? So they're still hanging out, trying to ambush whoever they can. The war has happened now. No one's told these orcs the war's over. Thranduil, remember, is leading the remnants of his army back to Greenwood. And they've lost their king, Aurafur. They've lost a whole bunch of their comrades, and so it's probably a fairly sad processional as they go back home, even though they were on the winning side. The orcs see Thranduil. They let him pass again, because even though they're small, they have enough of an army to intimidate this small detachment of orcs. So they let Thranduil's group go, but they read that as, we won. We're on the winning side. That emboldens them, and it keeps them hanging out for another however many months until Isildur comes by, and then they attack. You could make the case, I get this is not a direct line, but indirectly, Aurafur's ill-advised charge, the fact that he didn't listen to Gil-galad and he charged and was killed along with a bunch of his men, led to Thranduil coming past that bit with the orcs without a full complement of a victorious army that gave the orcs the wrong opinion that Sauron's side had won or was winning, and made them stay in their place and then proceed to ambush Isildur, kill him, and have the ring lost. And so Aurafur killed Isildur. No, I'm not saying that. But it is interesting how potentially history could have been much different if Aurafur hadn't done that charge. Okay, so that's the year 2 of the Third Age. Kind of a low point for Thranduil. But, he's now king, leading his people. Flash forward to about the year 1000 of the Third Age. Sauron comes to Greenwood. In fact, he comes to that abandoned fortress, Amon Lanc, and that's what gets turned into Dol Guldur. So it was Aurafur's fortress is now Sauron's fortress. Here's a quote from the Silmarillion. Now of old the name of that forest was Greenwood the Great, the haunt of many beasts and of birds of bright song. And there was the realm of King Thranduil under the oak and the beech. But after many years, when well nigh 1/3 of that age of the world had passed, a darkness crept slowly through the wood from the southward, and fear walked there in shadowy glades. Fell beasts came hunting, and cruel and evil creatures laid their snares. Then the name of the forest was changed, and Mirkwood it was called, for the nightshade lay deep there, and few dared to pass through, save only in the north, where Thranduil's people still held the evil at bay. Whence it came few could tell, and it was long ere even the wise could discover it. It was the shadow of Sauron, and the sign of his return. In a dark hill he made his dwelling, and wrought there his sorcery, and all folk feared the sorcerer of Dol Guldur, and yet they knew not at first how great was their peril. Dol Guldur means the hill of sorcery, so it goes from Bald Hill to the hill of sorcery. And this is what propels Thranduil to create his halls in the Dark Mountains, the mountains of Mirkwood, and go underground to protect his people. Just to give commenter Marty Giavoto a glimpse at the history of Dol Guldur, 2063 of the Third Age, Gandalf chases Sauron out of Dol Guldur temporarily. Flash forward 800 years to 2850, Gandalf returns to Dol Guldur, finds Thrain, Thorin's dad, imprisoned there. Thrain gives him the key and the map to Erebor before dying. Gandalf lets the White Council know, hey, Sauron's back in Dol Guldur, but thanks to Saruman, the council decides not to attack at that point. Flash forward another 100 years, basically, to 2941 of the Third Age. This is where the White Council does indeed chase Sauron from Dol Guldur, but this is also when Bilbo and the dwarves go on their quest for Erebor. Those two events are timed by Gandalf to occur around the same time. And The Hobbit is where we get a bunch of information about Thranduil, including some actual quotes. I should note that Thranduil's name never appears in The Hobbit. He is just known as the Elven King. But we know that the Elven King in the Woodland Realm at that time was most certainly Thranduil. So, ergo, Elven King equals Thranduil. This passage is when Thorin is captured and is interrogated by Thranduil. We see a version of this played out in the Hobbit movies. So, to the cave they dragged Thorin, not too gently, for they did not love dwarves, and thought he was an enemy. In ancient days they had had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure. It is only fair to say that the dwarves gave a different account, and said that they only took what was their due, for the Elf King had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver, and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. If the Elf King had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems. And though his hoard was rich, he was ever eager for more, since he had not yet as great a treasure as other elf lords of old. All this was well known to every dwarf, though Thorin's family had had nothing to do with the old quarrel I have spoken of. "Why did you and your folk 3 times try to attack my people in their merrymaking?" asked the king. "We did not attack them," answered Thorin. "We came to beg because we were starving." "Where are your friends now, and what are they doing?" "I don't know, but I expect starving in the forest." "What were you doing in the forest?" "Looking for food and drink because we were starving." "But what brought you into the forest at all?" asked the king angrily. At that, Thorin shut his mouth and would not say another word. "Very well," said the king. "Take him away, and keep him safe until he feels inclined to tell the truth, even if he waits 100 years. So there you see a version of what I mentioned before about King Thingol hiring the dwarves to put the Silmaril onto the Nauglamir, and then the dwarves wanting to take it as payment, and then this war breaks out. And then we see how Thranduil has this love for treasure, this silver and white gems, and also how he has this kind of chip on his shoulder about how his treasure hoard isn't to the level of what other elf lords would have been. Probably Thingol, who had a Silmaril. Also, obviously, this mistrust of the dwarves. Now, it's in one of these conversations in the movies where Thranduil mentions that, I faced the serpents of the north, and we see that he has this wound on his face. And it's Vincenzo who asked, what's the background to that? That is an invention of Peter Jackson. As far as I know, there's no mention of Thranduil fighting dragons. The Sindar Elves didn't do really much of the fighting in the First Age. So maybe, the War of Wrath, there were some dragons. I don't think Thranduil probably fought in the War of Wrath in the First Age. And we don't see much of the dragons in the Second Age. And we don't really see dragons in Mirkwood. I would say the closest you could get to is the fact that north of Mirkwood is a place called the Withered Heath. This is where a lot of dragons lived. We don't know a ton about that region or the dragons. There are very few named dragons. I've done a video on the named dragons. You can check that out. But I don't see a situation where Thranduil would have traveled that far up to the Withered Heath or gotten near there that would have enabled him to then get in a fight with a dragon. So I don't see the circumstance in which he would have faced a dragon. That said, is it possible? Sure, just unwritten about. I think the intent was to show a connection between Thranduil and Thorin, in that Thranduil had witnessed a dragon and had seen the devastation, and so could relate to Smaug. In any case, it was a Peter Jackson creation for the movies, and I haven't really found any source that indicates that Thranduil fought dragons. So now we cut to the rest of the dwarves are captured. Bilbo's following along behind with the ring on, and they're being issued into the halls. We get a good description of the king's halls. Across the bridge, the elves thrust their prisoners, but Bilbo hesitated in the rear. He did not at all like the look of the cavern mouth, and he only made up his mind not to desert his friends just in time to scuttle over at the heels of the last elves before the great gates of the king closed behind them with a clang. Inside, the passages were lit with red torchlight, and the elf guards sang as they marched along the twisting, crossing, and echoing paths. These were not like those of the goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep underground, and filled with a cleaner air. In a great hall with pillars hewn out of the living stone sat the Elven King on a chair of carven wood. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for the autumn was come again. In the spring he wore a crown of woodland flowers. In his hand he held a carven staff of oak. The prisoners were brought before him, and though he looked grimly at them, he told his men to unbind them, for they were ragged and weary. Besides, they need no ropes in here, he said. There is no escape from my magic doors for those who are once brought inside. What have we done, O king? Said Balin, who was the eldest left. Is it a crime to be lost in the forest, to be hungry and thirsty, to be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pets, if killing them makes you angry? Such a question, of course, made the king angrier than ever, and he answered, It is a crime to wander in my realm without leave. Do you forget that you are in my kingdom, using the road that my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue and trouble my people in the forest and rouse the spiders with your riot and clamor? After all the disturbance you have made, I have a right to know what brings you here, and if you will not tell me now, I will keep you all in prison until you have learned sense and manners. So we see here that Thranduil gave them 3 chances to avoid being captured. But after the 3rd time of running into the elves, he's like, all right, fine, bring them in. And they have some reason for being here. Let's see if we can figure it out. And eventually he does figure it out. This is after they've escaped in the barrels. But he's a clever king, and he puts 2 and 2 together. The king knew now the dwarf's errand, or thought he did, and he said to himself, Very well, we'll see. No treasure will come back through Mirkwood without my having something to say in the matter. But I expect they will all come to a bad end, and serve them right. He, at any rate, did not believe in dwarves fighting and killing dragons like Smaug, and he strongly suspected attempted burglary or something like it. Which shows he was a wise elf, and wiser than the men of the town, though not quite right, as we shall see in the end. He sent out his spies about the shores of the lake, and as far northward towards the mountain as they would go, and waited. And so he does. He waits. And eventually his waiting proves fruitful. Now this next passage is interesting because we see some of the empathy from Thranduil. You know, the movies paint him as a bit of a jerk, and he is a bit of a jerk, but I think he's got a little more empathy in him, dare I say humanity in him, than perhaps we see depicted in the movies. Here we see his empathy displayed. But help came swiftly, for Bard at once had speedy messengers sent up the river to the forest to ask the aid of the king of the elves of the wood. And these messengers had found a host already on the move, although it was then only the 3rd day after the fall of Smaug. The Elven King had received news from his own messengers and from the birds that loved his folk, and already he knew much of what had happened. That will be the last we hear of Thorin Oakenshield, I fear, said the king. He would have done better to have remained my guest. It is an ill wind all the same, he added, that blows no one any good. But the king, when he received the prayers of Bard, had pity, for he was the lord of a good and kindly people. So, turning his march, which had at first been direct towards the mountain, he hastened now down the river to the long lake. He had not boats or rafts enough for his host, and they were forced to go the slower way by foot, but great store of goods he sent ahead by water. So he finds out what's happened with Smaug and the death of Smaug. He's on his way to the mountain. He gets this plea from Bard because the city is destroyed and people are suffering. And so he diverts his task to go help the people of Long Lake. Now we cut to that really cool moment when Bilbo kind of breaks into the enemy camp with the Arkenstone. He's going to use the Arkenstone to bargain a peaceful resolution between the dwarves and the elves and humans. And so he ends up in the tent with Thranduil. This is where Thranduil gets to meet Bilbo Baggins. And he drew forth the Arkenstone. The elven king himself, whose eyes were used to things of wonder and beauty, stood up in amazement. "This is the Arkenstone of Thrain," said Bilbo, "the heart of the mountain, and it is also the heart of Thorin. He values it above a river of gold. I give it to you. It will aid you in your bargaining." The elven king looked at Bilbo with a new wonder. "Bilbo Baggins," he said, "you are more worthy to wear the armor of elven princes than many that have looked more comely in it. But I wonder if Thorin Oakenshield will see it so. I have more knowledge of dwarves in general than you have, perhaps. I advise you to remain with us, and here you shall be honored and thrice welcome." "Thank you very much, I am sure," said Bilbo with a bow, "but I don't think I ought to leave my friends like this, after all we've gone through together. And I promised to wake old Bomber at midnight, too. Really, I must be going, and quickly." So Bilbo meets with Thranduil and Bard, gives them the Arkenstone, and makes this lasting impression, right? Here's somebody willing to give up this really, really impressive gem. Again, this harkens back to Thingol and his obsession with this really expensive gem that led to so much death and destruction between elves and dwarves. And so Thranduil seeing this hobbit perhaps displaying more self-control than he had seen elves and dwarves display in the past. And note that comment where Thranduil says, "I have more knowledge of dwarves in general than you have, perhaps." Again, that reference back to, I remember when the dwarves did terrible things to the elves and vice versa. Obviously, Thranduil leads his people in the Battle of the Five Armies, where they join up with the humans and the eagles and the dwarves to fight against the orcs. It's a major victory for the good guys. And after the battle, at Thorin's funeral, it's Thranduil who puts Orcrist, that elven blade that Thorin found and used, he puts that on Thorin's tomb. That's kind of a gesture of respect from the elves. And so now this is the last passage I'm going to read from The Hobbit. This is the parting of Bilbo and Thranduil. It's the last conversation they have. "Farewell, O elven king," said Gandalf. "Merry be the greenwood while the world is yet young, and merry be all your folk." "Farewell, O Gandalf," said the king. "May you ever appear where you are most needed and least expected. The oftener you appear in my halls, the better shall I be pleased." "I beg of you," said Bilbo, stammering and standing on one foot, "to accept this gift." And he brought out a necklace of silver and pearls that Dane had given him at their parting. "In what way have I earned such a gift, O hobbit?" said the king. "Well, I thought, don't you know," said Bilbo, rather confused, "that some little return should be made for your hospitality. I mean, even a burglar has his feelings. I have drunk much of your wine and eaten much of your bread." "I will take your gift, O Bilbo the Magnificent," said the king gravely, "and I name you elf-friend and blessed. May your shadow never grow less, or stealing would be too easy. Farewell." Then the elves turned towards the forest, and Bilbo started on his long road home. So interesting there. First of all, there's the conversation with Gandalf. We see later Gandalf is going to return to Thranduil's halls, and Bilbo gives this necklace, this silver necklace of pearls, to Thranduil, this thing that we know that Thranduil values so highly. Again, a kind of a reference back to Thingol and this necklace that he valued so highly. We see a lot of these parallels. I like the fact that he has a little bit of a sense of humor with Bilbo. You know, may your shadow never grow less, or stealing would be too easy. but he calls him Bilbo the Magnificent, names him an elf friend. That's huge, right? The king of the elves calling you elf friend. So we see that Bilbo has made a really strong relationship with Thranduil and the elves of the Woodland Realm. So that's 2941 of the Third Age. We now get to the events of The Lord of the Rings. The year 3017. Gollum is released from Mordor. He's been tortured, but let go. Aragorn captures him in the Dead Marshes, and he brings him to Thranduil in Mirkwood. In 3018, Gollum escapes from Thranduil's people. I'm going to read you the passage there. This is Legolas at the council, divulging that Gollum has escaped. At length Boromir spoke. "He is a small thing, you say, this Gollum? What became of him? To what doom did you put him?" "He is in prison, but no worse," said Aragorn. "He had suffered much. There is no doubt that he was tormented, and the fear of Sauron lies black on his heart. Still, I, for one, am glad that he is safely kept by the watchful elves of Mirkwood. He could work much mischief still if he were free, and I do not doubt that he was allowed to leave Mordor on some evil errand." "Alas, alas!" cried Legolas, and in his fair elvish face there was great distress. "The tidings that I was sent to bring must now be told. They are not good, but only here have I learned how evil they may seem to this company. Sméagol, who is now called Gollum, has escaped." "Escaped?" cried Aragorn. "That is ill news indeed. We shall all rue it bitterly, I fear. How came the folk of Thranduil to fail in their trust?" "Not through lack of watchfulness," said Legolas, "but perhaps through over-kindliness. And we fear that the prisoner had aid from others. We guarded this creature day and night at Gandalf's bidding, but Gandalf bade us hope still for his cure. And we had not the heart to keep him ever in dungeons under the earth, where he would fall back to his old black thoughts." "You were less tender to me," said Glóin, with a flash of his eyes, as old memories were stirred of his imprisonment in the deep places of the Elven King's halls. So that last bit is interesting, right? That's Glóin. Gimli's dad was one of the dwarves who was imprisoned by Thranduil in the events of The Hobbit. He's saying, you cared about Gollum's well-being, didn't want to imprison him for too long in the dungeons? Well, what about me? What about the dwarves? So you could see again this enmity between the dwarves and the elves come up, and it's regarding back to Thranduil's decision to imprison the company of the dwarves. But also we see that it's Gollum's escape that is the reason that we have Legolas in the story. Thranduil has sent his son Legolas to report to Elrond and the council that, oops, Gollum has escaped. Obviously then Legolas is there in order to be chosen for the fellowship and to go off. If Gollum doesn't escape, Legolas probably isn't sent there, and perhaps he's not part of the fellowship, as it turns out. What we also learn is that Gollum did not escape by accident. It was Sauron's intention to free him. So it was that Sauron prepared 2 strokes, in which many after saw the beginnings of the War of the Ring. They were made together. The orcs assailed the realm of Thranduil with orders to recapture Gollum, and the Lord of Morgul was sent forth openly to battle against Gondor. So we've got Lord of Morgul attacking Osgiliath. At the same time, the orcs are sent to free Gollum from Thranduil's folk. And this is seen in some ways as the beginning of the War of the Ring. Now here's where I'm going to point out an interesting discrepancy we have between the Unfinished Tales and Lord of the Rings in regards to Thranduil's halls. First, I'm going to read you the passage from Unfinished Tales. "No doubt Thranduil was following the example of King Thingol long before in Doriath, though his halls were not to be compared with Menegroth. He had not the arts, nor the wealth, nor the aid of the dwarves." So as I've been mentioning, we see that Thranduil, inspired by King Thingol, creates this cave system for his own elven halls. But here it says they're not really to compare with Menegroth, at least partially because he didn't have the aid of the dwarves in crafting them like Thingol did. Now, in the Two Towers, we have this conversation between Gimli and Legolas, in which Gimli is inviting Legolas to come see the Glittering Caves. They're the caves that are at Helm's Deep. And we see that Legolas is a little less than enthused to go visit, but Gimli assures him it's this amazing place. "And I would give gold to be excused," said Legolas, "and double to be let out if I strayed in." "You have not seen, so I forgive your jest," said Gimli. "But you speak like a fool. Do you think those halls are fair where your king dwells under the hill in Mirkwood? And dwarves helped in their making long ago? They are but hovels, compared with the caverns I have seen here." Gimli says the dwarves helped in the making of Thranduil's halls. Seems like a direct contradiction to what we see there in the Unfinished Tales. And if you had to pick a source that's more canon, you would say Lord of the Rings is more canon. So I would lean toward the idea that Gimli is speaking correctly, that the dwarves did, in fact, aid Thranduil in creating his halls. If that's the case, we see maybe a little less xenophobia out of Thranduil than we might have otherwise. Like his father probably wouldn't have allowed for dwarves to help him out. So perhaps some of this empathy, perhaps some of this willingness to unify, to work with others, is present in Thranduil. It's passed down to his son. So now we cut to 3019, the Battle of Pelennor Fields. That's where Theoden is killed, where Eowyn kills the Witch King. Big victory for the good guys. So what's happening with Thranduil at this point? Well, he's also fighting and winning a battle of his own, as is Galadriel in Lorien. So it's a fight on many fronts. After the fall of the Dark Tower and the passing of Sauron, the shadow was lifted from the hearts of all who opposed him. 3 times Lorien had been assailed from Dol Guldur. But besides the valor of the elven people of that land, the power that dwelt there was too great for any to overcome, unless Sauron had come there himself. Though grievous harm was done to the fair woods on the borders, the assaults were driven back, and when the shadow passed, they took Dol Guldur, and Galadriel threw down its walls and laid bare its pits, and the forest was cleansed. In the north, also there had been war and evil. The realm of Thranduil was invaded, and there was long battle under the trees and great ruin of fire. But in the end, Thranduil had the victory. And on the day of the new year of the elves, Celeborn and Thranduil met in the midst of the forest, and they renamed Mirkwood Erin Las Gallen, the Wood of Green Leaves. Thranduil took all the northern region as far as the mountains that rise in the forest for his realm, and Celeborn took all the southern wood below the Narrows and named it East Lorien. But after the passing of Galadriel in a few years, Celeborn grew weary of his realm and went to Imladris to dwell with the sons of Elrond. In the Greenwood, the Sylvan Elves remained untroubled. So, Lorien had been attacked 3 different times, but here during the Battle of Pelennor Fields, there's what is known as the Battle Under the Trees, in which Thranduil fends off Sauron's forces. There's a lot of ruin, but they come through victorious, and then he and Celeborn meet to essentially divide up Mirkwood, and they rename it. They call it Erin Las Gallen, the Wood of Green Leaves. I find it interesting that Legolas is translated as Greenleaf. So his dad named the forest, in some ways, after his son. Celeborn ended up taking control of the southern portion of Erin Las Gallen, which includes Dol Guldur. And so once again, it became more like Amon Lânc, a fortress for the good guys. So we see that Thranduil fought in some major battles, right? He fought in the War of Last Alliance. He fought in the Battle of 5 Armies. And he fought in this battle under the trees. So a warrior king. And he led his people through these very, very tough times. So that leaves the question of, did Thranduil eventually decide to go west? You know, at the beginning of the Second Age, he had the option, the Sindar Elves, and he and his dad chose not to go west. They went east instead. Did he go west? We do not definitively know the answer to that question. It is not said anywhere, and Thranduil went west. I think the assumption is that he eventually did. I think, though, you could make the case that perhaps he didn't. There is a quote that mentions that when Celeborn went west, that the last elf with memories of the Elder Days left Middle-earth. Well, Thranduil would have memories of the Elder Days, so that implies that perhaps Thranduil also went west. And there is some small evidence to suggest that indeed Thranduil did go west. This isn't this is like a quasi-canon thing, but there is a set of poems called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. It's not all about Tom Bombadil, but it's a series of poems that Tolkien wrote that are kind of in his Middle-earth mythology. One of them is called The Last Ship, and it's talking about the last boat that Círdan took from the Grey Havens to the west. I'm not going to read you the whole poem, but there's this one stanza that has some pretty relevant language in it. Here we go. A ship with golden beak, and oar and timbers white, came gliding. Swans went sailing on before, her tall prow guiding. Fair folk out of Elvenland in silver grey were rowing, and 3 with crowns she saw there stand, with bright hair flowing. So it mentions, here's the boat, it's leaving, it is the last ship, as the name of the poem suggests, and it mentions that there are 3 elves with crowns on this boat. Well, one of them is Círdan. He was on the last ship. We are pretty sure that Celeborn was on the last ship, because as I mentioned, there's this quote, I'm not reading it at the moment, but when Celeborn left, he was the last with knowledge of the Elder Days to leave. So we get the idea that he was also on the last ship. So, and they're both kings, right? So Círdan and Celeborn are on the ship. Who's the third one? A third elf with a crown? That's a pretty limited group that's still around at this point. It almost has to be Thranduil that's mentioned in this poem. So that's not definitive, as I say, it's not 100%, but it seems to mention that on this last ship there were 3 elven kings. One of them would almost certainly be Thranduil in that instance. We also know that Legolas does sail west eventually as well, so I think it's reasonable to assume that Thranduil also journeyed to the west. So there you have it. The history of Thranduil, father of Legolas, and a little mini history of Aman-Lanc / Dol Guldur. Thanks so much for suggesting the topic. Samesh, Andreas, Vincenzo, and Marty. If you have a topic you'd like me to talk about, feel free to put it in the comments. Be happy to do a video about a topic of your choosing. Thanks so much.